In this video class, I would like to walk you through the way we approach traumatic symptoms in the gentle trauma release method. Compared to the clinical understanding of what exactly can be considered a symptom of trauma, ours is a more expanded view. Let me now offer you some tips to help you recognize if what your client is expressing can be considered a symptom of traumatization. Let's begin. Let's start with a little recap here. We said that when you're conducting a powerful GTR session, in that first stage of history taking, you want to be able to do two things. First of all, you want to identify your client's traumatic symptoms. And second, you want to be able to find specific events behind those symptoms, because those will be the events that you'll eventually want to clear. In this lecture, we're going to focus on that first part, on finding traumatic symptoms. And let me begin by saying that unless you are qualified to do so, you won't be diagnosing or treating PTSD in your work. And the same goes for any other physical or mental health issues. If the client has difficulty functioning in life and you don't have the appropriate mental health or medical training, you have to refer them to a trained mental health or medical specialist. In fact, a client's lack of ability to function in life is a good rule of thumb to decide whether or not to take on someone as a client, or if they are out of your league, so to speak. However, please remember that just because someone doesn't officially qualify for a PTSD diagnosis doesn't mean that they're symptom-free. It doesn't mean that they're trauma-free. And that's where our work comes into play. They might be able to function, but with way more difficulty compared to how they were able to function before their traumatic symptoms emerged. Even outside a PTSD diagnosis, traumatic symptoms can be present, although they might be either a little different or milder. Milder to the point that the person would still need help with trauma outside the clinical setting, so they can go back to thriving in their life. In the GTR method, we operate with the concept of trauma spectrum response, and this is a wider way of looking at traumatic symptoms, acknowledging that trauma can express itself in many different ways, not just what is officially considered to be symptoms of classic PTSD. In the GTR Institute, we believe that there are more traumatic symptoms that many of the official diagnoses cover. We believe that there's a wider spectrum of traumatic symptoms. And just to recap, we operate on the assumption that all the different signs and symptoms of trauma can differ from classic PTSD and other formal diagnoses in either intensity, absence of some of the classic PTSD symptoms, or presence of additional symptoms that are not mentioned in the PTSD diagnosis. Trauma changes our nervous system, specifically in a way that the body is not able to switch off the fight, flight, or freeze response, even when the threat is no longer present. And a survival response like that has never been turned off, even after the threat is gone, means that we are practically superimposing trauma on all our experiences. Everything that we see that through the lenses of trauma, because the body believes that the threat is still out there. Our body thinks we're not safe. And that means that a walk in the street might feel like a walk in a minefield to a victim of abuse, rape, or torture. Every face, every voice can potentially be a reminder of the past, some of its horrors, and send that person into rage, panic, or total collapse. Or the symptoms can be milder. Maybe it's not rage, but just inexplicable anger. Maybe it's not panic, just a feeling of, I gotta get out of here. Or maybe it's not a total collapse, as an extreme example of a freeze response, but perhaps just a sense that we can't feel our body, can't feel it at all, as though we were not in it in that moment. Now, why does it happen like this? If, for whatever reason, we didn't get the chance to finish a survival response because it was prevented or blocked in some way, for example, we were trapped in a burning building or in a war zone, or we were overpowered and held down by the abuser or the attacker, then what happens is that the electric circuits of the brain responsible for that fight, flight, freeze mode, they continue to fire. And as long as these circuits fire, they continue to send the body the message that it needs to fight or run or freeze, because the brain still thinks it's under attack or under threat. And when we get stuck in the fight, flight, or freeze mode like that, or any combination of them, the responses will kick in automatically, whether we like it or not, and leave us in a state of unconsciously expecting the threat to return at any moment. So in a way, trauma leaves us in an overdone survival response mode. Some of us will get stuck more in the fight mode, while others in the flight or freeze mode. Overall, whether it's PTSD, complex PTSD, or traumatic stress, our system stays chronically aroused and stays on permanent alert, never being able to switch off that survival response because the trauma that we experienced has reconditioned our nervous system. Let's now go through each response when stuck in that overdone mode, because being able to spot an overdone fight, flight, or freeze response in your client is a great strategy to indicate traumatization. The fight instinct makes it possible for the animal to fight back, to confront the opponent face on, but it also allows us to protect ourselves, to be assertive and set boundaries. The way it typically expresses itself on the emotional level is through the emotion of anger or rage. When trauma is not attended to, then anger and rage can persevere as an unresolved fight response. Many veterans come back from war, and even though they were sweet, relaxed guys before, when they come back, they can have these aggressive outbursts to the point that they start to be dangerous to their family members and they have to move out. And they can't control it. In other words, their system responds to trauma in the fight mode and they can get stuck in it. That's the way their particular traumatic symptoms express themselves. But if you think about it, even if we become too stressed, this might be the type of survival response that our system tends to overdo, in that we become irritable, aggressive, enraged, explosive, controlling, or bullying. Now, why would this happen? Can they control it? Think of a turned-on survival response as one of Pavlov's dogs. Whenever the dog hears the bell ringing, he starts salivating because his system has learned that the bell means food is coming. But the dog can't control his production of saliva. He will salivate every time the bell rings, whether he wants it or not. And that's because he's conditioned to do so. And the sound of the bell triggers that conditioned response. In a traumatized system with a turned-on fight, flight, or freeze response, we become like that Pavlov's dog. Only our triggers don't limit themselves to the sound of the bell. In fact, whenever our brain perceives something as threat, the thinking part of the brain shuts down, and whether we want it or not, we switch on the fight, flight, freeze mode. Let's look at the flight response now. The flight instinct allows us to escape when it doesn't make sense to fight back. Because sometimes this is the most sensible strategy for our survival. For example, when we're overpowered, we can disengage and we can run away because fighting back or confrontation would only make things worse. The flight response typically expresses itself on the emotional level as fear, usually anxiety, hypervigilance, or startle response. A person stuck in the flight survivor mode will usually have anxiety issues. They will be hypervigilant, always on guard. They will be stuck in the constant anticipation of the next bad thing to happen, or the other shoe to drop, or the next catastrophe to get unleashed. It's like this over-the-top awareness of any possible sign of threat or danger. And here are some examples of how that can show up in a person. You might see constant underlying anxiety, constantly being on guard and being hypervigilant. They might be panicky or manic-like. It might appear as though they're like that chicken with its head cut off. Or they might be busy being busy all the time. They may look hyperactive or even obsessive compulsive. They might not be able to sit still and they have to fidget all the time. And we're talking when this starts happening out of nowhere. So they have not been like that. It's not their personality. And finally, there's the freeze response. It can be a healthy response, just like fight or flight. It allows us to retreat when struggling, resisting, or running is futile or counterproductive. Just like with other animals, it allows us to hide before either we get noticed or before we figure out our next move. It also helps us minimize pain if threat is inevitable. The way the freeze response typically expresses itself on the emotional level is through emotional numbness, withdrawal, or dissociation. When clients start to respond to life in the overdone freeze mode, that's probably the toughest for them as well as for the practitioner, because when they become detached from life and other people, they also become too numb to feel anything. The overdone freeze response can look like numbness, so the client appears numb, apathetic, lethargic, or depressed, passive. They can appear dissociated and detached from themselves, from the world, from life at large. We often see them being isolated or socially withdrawn. We observe these hermit-like behaviors. They might become adrenaline junkies, just like I said, or highly promiscuous, or cut themselves when they can't make that numbness go away. Let me now go back to the concept that I began this class with, the concept of widening the range of traumatic symptoms. Some practitioners working with trauma survivors find that the rigid and fixed diagnostic criteria of PTSD, as presented in the DSM, are not an accurate representation of the range of symptoms that clients present. In the GTR Institute, we too believe that we need to be aware of a way wider and more diverse range of traumatic symptoms that can show up once a human being has been exposed to trauma. I will now walk you through such a wider way of looking at traumatic symptoms. This is an approach that we will encourage you to take while training to become a GTR practitioner. This categorization of symptoms is presented to you neatly in the holistic well-being check-in, and that's what I'll be referring to from now on. The GTR method is based on the assumption that the person carrying trauma in their system can display any of the following symptoms: physical symptoms, emotional symptoms, and/or cognitive and motivational symptoms. You will receive in your training a resource that has a detailed overview of these 3 categories. It's called the Holistic Wellbeing Check-in, and it's a handout that I typically give to clients before our very first gentle trauma release session. It looks like the picture on the slide. That's the cover picture, just so you recognize it when you download it. Let's first look at the physical symptoms. Traumatized people often complain of numerous different types of physical symptoms, and these are some of the most common ones: chronic pain, muscle armoring, physical numbness, migraines or tension headaches, sleep problems, gastrointestinal problems, or digestive disorders, chronic fatigue, depleted energy, weight issues or eating issues, weakened immunity, and any other physical symptoms that appeared out of nowhere or got intense very fast. Just so you understand, having these symptoms does not automatically mean that they have to be trauma-related. Let's take pain, for example. Physical pain can be the consequence of many things, but the type of pain that is often a symptom of trauma is chronic pain. Chronic pain is, in essence, an incorrect learning of our body that still acts as if the threat persisted. And chronic pain is often a result of trauma, especially if the following conditions are in place. There's either no history or no evidence of injury, meaning there's no anatomical or medical reason for the injury. Chronic pain can also be traumatic when there's no response to traditional healing modalities, or they were extremely unsuccessful. And finally, there is often an unresolved traumatic event present, relatively accessible in that the client can pinpoint, well, it happened approximately when this was going on. But if they don't know, you can still investigate. You might have heard about cases of people going through a very traumatic event, such as a car accident or a rape, and then hearing from them that there came a point when they realized that they were watching the scene with themselves in it as if from the ceiling, from above. Some view this as a spiritual experience. But what happens is that the brain induces a sense of detached calm. It distorts their perception to the point that it feels like it's not really happening for them, like it's just a very bad dream that will end as soon as they wake up. There might also be amnesia, meaning they won't remember parts of that experience, or that experience as a whole. In some ways, dissociation is an extreme form of the freeze response. When your brain understands that all action is futile, then instead of doing something with your physical body, such as making you run or fight, it can sometimes try to protect you by altering your awareness, the state of your consciousness. And you might get that unreal feeling, that dreamlike feeling, when the horror of the situation is too much to bear. Now, this dissociative response can be adaptive at the moment of total helplessness, but it also becomes maladaptive after the threat or the danger is gone. And becomes maladaptive because it prevents us from processing and integrating that experience, which is crucial for healing. So the person walks through life being numb. And when someone is stuck in the freeze response, then numbing becomes a chronic default mechanism to most stimuli. When the brain overgeneralizes the numbing to just about everything. And this is when it starts to feel like they're not even participants in their own life, when they go through life soulless and meaningless. Now, when dissociation goes on for a while, it is excruciating for that person. It might seem like it's better to feel nothing compared to feeling something painful, but not in the long run. Because even the emptiness is a feeling, and it is intense to the point that you would go to extreme measures to escape it if you were to feel it in the long run. And people can do extreme things to escape that numb feeling. They can go to sensation-seeking behaviors such as bungee jumping, or what I mentioned before, they can cut themselves or practice extreme promiscuity just to feel something. Now, that emotional dissociation automatically implies being dissociated from the body, because it's through the body that we have access to emotions. Everyone with trauma has some degree of dissociation from the body. And this is because it's just the body's way of managing the overwhelm, whether it's emotional overwhelm, the feelings of terror, anxiety, shock, or whether it's physical overwhelm, say that extreme or chronic pain. This body dissociation, this bodily numbness, is a very typical symptom of trauma. And this goes for all types, not just the freeze type. Traumatized people often cannot tolerate the overwhelming bodily sensations. And this is where the problem lies, because if you can't feel your body, you can't feel yourself. Contemporary neuroscience tells us that our sense of self relies on a vital connection with our body. The very core of our self-awareness is the result of the physical sensations that let us know the state of our body. Thanks to neuroscience, we now know for a fact that in order to have a sense of self, to be aware of ourself, we have to be able to A, feel, and B, interpret our physical sensations. If we're dissociated from the body, we lack a sense of self. And not having a solid sense of self is a common but little talked about symptom of trauma. This is when people say, I don't even know where I end and where other people begin. Or I can't set boundaries. I don't even know what I like. I don't know who I am. I feel lost in this body. I feel like I'm just watching my life unfold in front of me like a movie, but I'm not a participant in that movie. I completely lack self-confidence. I don't feel in charge of myself. All of these can potentially be the consequences of not having a solid sense of self. The next category of traumatic symptoms are emotional symptoms. Again, the following comes from the Holistic Wellbeing Check-in handout, so I'm not going to read everything, just scan the list here a little bit. Some of the most common symptoms include constant underlying anxiety, panic attacks, phobias, or the opposite side of the spectrum, depression, apathy, feeling emotionally numb, or even having mood swings. Then there can be hypervigilance, feeling on the edge, or excessive worrying. We can have pessimistic thinking. We can have hopelessness, helplessness, or anger and rage and short temper. Let me spend some time on a couple of these emotional symptoms that I want to highlight here. Once you start following trauma experts and listening to what therapists and doctors working with trauma patients say when these people share their experiences, you will spot many common themes. And one of them is what I call the guilt paradox, which means that instead of the perpetrator feeling guilty, or despite understanding that some things are not within our control, the victims of trauma often feel badly about themselves, as though they have done something wrong, beating up on themselves for many different reasons. I should have not been there at the wrong time, in the wrong place. I should have acted in a calmer, dignified manner instead of being scared like a little child. I should have said something to the attacker or defended myself fiercely. I should not be so shattered by this experience. Or maybe I deserve all of this. I was so stupid to allow this happen, so maybe this serves me right. To put it differently, on top of the horror of trauma, many people who have gone through traumatization also develop a very strong inner critic. The voice inside their head telling them how deficient, faulty, and lacking they are. In the case of someone who has gone through years and years of childhood abuse or other forms of long-term abuse, this critical voice will not be just their own voice, but also the voice of others. Taming that critical voice is so crucial in trauma work, especially in cases of complex trauma, that it is part of my own trauma release packages, and it's also part of this training to teach you how to work with that inner critic. Mostly in cases of complex trauma or long-term trauma, we see that this voice reaches a state where people are often not even aware of it anymore. However, what they are aware of is this agonizing mixture of the worst emotions a person might possibly have about themselves. Feelings of being worthless, repulsive, deficient, all at the same time. These feelings, this mixture of all these painful emotions about the self, seem to come out of nowhere. All these people notice is getting lost in a wave of self-criticism, self-loathing, and self-hatred. And this is what is often referred to as emotional flashbacks. These emotional flashbacks can feel like just wanting to collapse, sob, and cry in a corner, or feel deeply ashamed despite actually doing well or okay in life. Because emotional flashbacks seem to come out of nowhere, although in reality they are the handiwork of the inner critic, they can be disorienting and confusing, mostly when it comes to the intensity and the sudden arrival of these feelings. Sometimes that can make people crazy because they don't know that they're having an emotional flashback. Typically, these flashbacks, these emotional flashbacks, leave a person feeling powerless, insignificant, small, humiliated, faulty, worthless, stupid, ugly, just somehow very, very flawed. Emotional flashbacks can also be oriented towards something outside the self, and often in trauma you get both, the voice that attacks the self as well as the one that attacks and blames the world or someone else, because their basic trust in the world and the people in it has been lost. In this case, the person can experience the feelings of no one can be trusted, everyone is flawed, everyone will end up hurting me. Let's now talk about another common emotional symptom of trauma. It's the so-called repetition compulsion, also known as reenactment, because this is also a clue that someone has trauma going on. One theory states that trauma leaves us in a state of helplessness and powerlessness, and that these feelings are so unbearably painful for us human beings that we unconsciously look for ways to resolve them. As this theory has it, because helplessness is the essential insult of trauma, we long for taking our power back. And a traumatized person unconsciously believes that exposing themselves to the original trauma in some way will lead to that resolution, to restoring their sense of power and dignity. A more common sense hypothesis, one that we can now prove through neuroimaging, is that traumatized people can't tell what is safe and what is not safe because of the changes in the brain. They tend to continuously get involved in situations and with people that are not safe, not good for them. And this brings us back to being dissociated from the body and not being able to register the signal saying, careful, this is not safe for you. This is not good for you. In practical terms, repetition compulsion means that the person will repeat their trauma over and over again, almost like that notorious example of a woman who chooses the same type of guy every single time, one that will end up abusing her. Another way repetition compulsion can express itself is that the person will put themselves in situations where trauma is likely to happen. This doesn't have to be the same type of trauma, such as being sexually abused, but it can be accidents, loss of job, loss of business opportunities, betrayals by friends, lovers, colleagues. And from the outside, this can look like these people are seriously out of luck, that the fairy godmother has forgotten about them. They seem so unlucky, but it's actually a pattern of repetition compulsion where they cannot read the cues of safety and danger in the proper way. Now, overall repetition compulsion and emotional flashbacks are not the only emotional symptoms of trauma. There's way more, as you will be able to see on your list in the Holistic Wellbeing Check-in, but I wanted to highlight these two mainly because they are so common and yet sometimes difficult to understand or hard to spot in their connection to trauma. The last category are cognitive and motivational symptoms, and these are often the most overlooked symptoms, ones that we often see in coaching. They include things like the inability of the person to move forward with goals, whether they're personal or professional, or feeling stuck here. They include procrastination and self-sabotage on important projects. But they also include cognitive issues such as concentration issues, fuzzy thinking, memory issues, difficulty making decisions. Cognitive and motivational symptoms can also have to do with a distorted perception of time, with blowing things out of proportions or jumping to conclusions. The client may lose their meaning and purpose in life. What I would like to focus on a little bit more here to help you recognize trauma in a person is the perception of time and the relationship to time that people have after trauma. If someone's brain has been reliving traumatic memories for long enough, it will affect how this person perceives time. Traumatization can cause distortions in the perception of time, and it can change one's relationship to time altogether. This might show in different ways. You may see a loss of interest in the present moment in your client because all they can see are these past moments that they have been reliving in their head. And as they do so more and more, the present stops to be compelling enough to attend to. This will eventually lead to losing a sense of a bright future because there's no reason to believe that the future will be something other than the repetition of the past. And when the past and the present are terrible, when there's no reason to believe why things should be any different from now on, the person loses hope that their future will be bright. They feel like they have really nothing to look forward to. Losing a sense of time is also quite common. Even science shows us that the part of our brain that acts as the timekeeper is affected in people who have gone through traumatic experiences. They simply lose their sense of time. They lose the sense of the continuity of time. It's almost like a story that has chapters missing in it. This has many practical implications. If you lose your sense of time, you might be disoriented. You can have brain fog or memory issues. But also you can be procrastinating on goals and projects. You may not be able to move forward with your goals. If you don't have a sense of a bright future, you will lose motivation to create a good life for yourself and others. In fact, these are some of the most common issues people come to coaching for, and yet many times their connection to trauma is not recognized. Here's one last thing that I would like you to realize. Symptoms of trauma don't always show up right after the event that triggered the onset of trauma. That is, right after the traumatic event. First of all, a very stressful event does not always lead to trauma. We all know that many people can go through a very traumatic event like a hurricane or a flood or a car accident, but not all of them will end up displaying symptoms of trauma. This is probably due to an interplay of several factors. We mentioned that you need to perceive something as a combination of threat and inescapability in order for your brain to encode that event as trauma. And not everyone perceives things in the same way. More importantly, it also looks like our brain has a resilience reservoir for how much trauma it can handle at a given time. It's almost like a glass that can handle a lot of stress when it's empty, but when it's full to begin with, it overflows. Let me give you a very simplistic example from everyday life. You know that in periods of life when there's not too much stress going on, you handle little bumps on the road really well. Say someone makes a comment that is inconsiderate or inappropriate, and normally you're able to get over it relatively fast, maybe even to laugh about it eventually. But if you're going through a period where you have a lot of stress going on, say your back has been hurting lately and you have a lot on your plate at work, your pet is sick, and this long winter is just dragging on, then the same inconsiderate comment can have a completely different effect. It may hurt you deeply, or it can send you into obsessing about what that other person meant and why did they say that, and there's no way you can find humor in it. By analogy, a traumatic event doesn't necessarily have to lead to symptoms of trauma, but may cause that resilience reservoir of our brain to become fuller and thus not able to take on any more before what is already in it is resolved. That way, when another element of stress appears, it can be the last drop that triggers the full-blown symptoms of trauma. It's almost as though there's only so much stress that your brain can take. To use the veterans as an example here again, many of them don't suffer from PTSD right on the spot. And this is often because they're still surrounded by the camaraderie and they have these bonds that they have created with other soldiers. So even in the middle of hell, their resilience reservoir does not overflow with stress. But then they come home and have to readjust to a new life, one that would be stressful even without the trauma. Having no job, having bills to pay, being intimate with their loved ones again. It's this adjustment stress that adds to the original stress coming from, say, combat trauma, but now their resilience reservoir is too full and starts to overflow, which in turn triggers full-blown symptoms of trauma. In my own practice, I often hear things like, I didn't used to have claustrophobia, but now out of nowhere, I start to feel panicky when I'm in a closed space, not standing close to an exit. Or height phobia or flying phobia. And the resilience reservoir metaphor explains why these symptoms emerged like that out of the blue. To say it in a nutshell, a traumatic event occurs, but the symptoms can be either delayed or not occurred at all. But also, that past trauma can be reawakened at any point. The expression of symptoms depends on the state of your resilience reservoir. This resilience reservoir, in turn, is affected by the subsequent stressors that may have nothing to do with the original traumatic event, but they can be the last drop that disrupts the balance in the brain and fills the resilience reservoir up to the top and beyond. And now we have the perfect foundation for traumatic symptoms to show up. This is also why it's so important to consistently take care of your own emotional well-being, traumatized or not. We want to keep that resilience reservoir in the best shape possible, and this is even more important for those of us who deal with stressed and traumatized clients in our practice. I hope you enjoyed this lecture, and until we speak next time, bye.